We're looking at a truly wild, lightning-fast 5-year period that completely rewrote the rulebook for India's anti-imperialist movement. I mean, between 1905 and 1909, the whole struggle shifted gear from polite, formal petitions to full-on militant nationalism. The masses woke up, brand new leaders stepped into the spotlight, and the British Empire, well, they had to radically change their tactics. Let's get into it. To really understand what's happening here, just look at this chilling quote. This is directly from H. Risley, the Home Secretary to the Government of India back in 1904. Read those words carefully. One of our main objects is to split up and thereby to weaken a solid body of opponents. I mean, they're saying the quiet part out loud, right? It explicitly reveals the high-stakes motives of the empire. They weren't just passively managing a colony. They were actively, strategically engineering divisions to protect their power.
So, here's our roadmap for this era. We'll track the rise of militancy, the Partition of Bengal, the Swadeshi and Boycott movements, the infamous Surat split, and finally, the government's repression and the 1909 reforms.
Part 1. The Rise of Militant Nationalism.
So, what actually sparked this massive shift away from those polite petitions? Take a look at this staggering number. This points to a truly grim reality. Between 1896 and 1900, devastating famine swept across the country, leaving 90 lakh people dead. It absolutely laid bare the exploitative side of colonial rule. The economic misery was just immense, and for anyone politically conscious at the time, it became glaringly obvious that an Indian government was the only real way out of this. You just can't feed a starving population with petitions, you know?
And at the exact same time, global events were totally shattering this whole myth of European invincibility. It was like a domino effect. Japan suddenly emerges as this massive industrial power. Ethiopia actually defeats the Italian army in 1896. The British are really struggling in the Boer Wars. And then the absolute shocker. Japan decisively defeats Russia in 1905. These events were a massive wake-up call. They proved to Indians that, yes, a united Asian country could absolutely take on a European superpower and win.
Which brings us to Part 2, the Partition of Bengal.
This was the explosive trigger, totally engineered by the British. Now, officially, their excuse was administrative. They claimed, hey, with 78 million people, Bengal is just way too big to manage effectively. But the true motive? Highly calculating. Bengal was literally the nerve center of Indian nationalism. So the real strategy, pushed by Lord Curzon, was to partition the province simply to split the people up and critically weaken any opposition to British rule.
And the truly shocking part is exactly how they weaponized the demographics. It wasn't random. The new borders were mathematically engineered so that Bengalis would suddenly be a linguistic minority right inside their own province. Plus, they deliberately sliced the region along religious lines, creating a Hindu-majority western half and a Muslim-majority eastern half with its capital over in Dhaka. They were actively pitting linguistic and religious communities against each other to completely break their unity.
Moving on to Part 3, the Swadeshi and Boycott movements. So, how did the people respond to this massive imperial chess move? Well, when the partition officially hit on October 16, 1905, it became a day of profound mourning all across Bengal. But surprisingly, it also became a day of incredible solidarity. People fasted. They bathed in the Ganga. They walked barefoot in massive processions. They sang Bande Mataram, which just spontaneously became the anthem of the whole movement. And in this really beautiful gesture, people actually tied Rockies on each other's wrists as a symbol of the unbreakable bond between the two halves of Bengal. Now, while the moderates started the anti-partition campaign the usual way, pamphlets, petitions, the leadership very quickly shifted to the extremists. We're talking about leaders like Tilak, Bipin Chandra Pal, and Aurobindo Ghosh. And their program evolved fast into direct, on-the-ground action. They boycotted foreign goods. They organized massive public processions. They formed these highly disciplined volunteer corps known as Samitis to really mobilize the grassroots. They even set up indigenous Swadeshi textile mills, banks, and soap factories. Essentially, they were building a parallel, self-reliant economy from scratch. And because of these bold new tactics, the movement's social base just exploded. It wasn't just wealthy landowners or upper-class intellectuals anymore. Students started boycotting government schools. And absolutely crucially, Indian women stepped out of their homes in huge numbers to join the protest and picketing. This was a massive, unprecedented leap forward. It was really the birth of true mass participation.
Which brings us to Part 4, the Surat split.
But here's the catch. All this intense, radical new energy created massive friction right inside the Indian National Congress. They were being torn apart by a stark ideological battle. On one side, you have the moderates, generally wealthier, inspired by Western liberalism, and strictly committed to constitutional methods and ultimately loyalty to the crown. On the flip side, the extremists, largely from the educated lower middle classes, inspired deeply by Indian cultural heritage, entirely rejecting any British connection and demanding direct political action. They were so fundamentally opposed on how to achieve freedom that making any kind of internal compromise became practically impossible.
And this rigid clash finally boiled over in the infamous 1907 Surat split. Both factions just dug their heels in over leadership roles and the exact resolutions for the Swadeshi and Boycott programs. It was a complete disaster internally. The moderates kept control of the Congress, sure, but the national movement as a whole was left deeply wounded, fractured, and somewhat leaderless, at the exact moment when they needed a united front the most.
Finally, Part 5. Repression in the 1909 Reforms. Sensing this deep, glaring division in the Indian leadership, the empire wasted no time. They launched a massive legal sledgehammer to regain total control. We see this devastating wave of draconian legislation roll out: the Seditious Meetings Act, the Criminal Law Amendment Act, severe press acts. The whole goal was to quickly and ruthlessly crush the extremists. Every peaceful avenue for protest was systematically shut down, and prominent leaders were actively targeted. This eventually led to major figures like Tilak being put on trial for sedition and thrown in prison. Okay, let's actually break down the insidious strategy the British used here. It's your classic carrot and stick approach, or repression, conciliation, and suppression. Step 1, mildly repress the extremists, just enough to scare the moderates. Step 2, dangle the carrot. Start hinting at future constitutional reforms to placate the moderates and ensure they cut ties with the extremists. Then, step 3, once the moderates are completely isolated and appeased, bring down the full might of the state to suppress the extremists entirely. It was, honestly, a masterclass in divide and conquer. And that so-called carrot finally showed up as the Marley-Minto reforms of 1909. Now, yes, it slightly increased the number of elected Indians in the legislative councils, but the real, truly devastating impact of this reform was the introduction of separate electorates for Muslims. By literally separating voters by their religion, the British slyly planted this incredibly dangerous seed of communal division straight into the Indian political system. The whole thing was perfectly designed to put a hard stop to any growing unity among Indians. Just look at this timeline and see how fast this upheaval escalates. 1903, the partition is proposed. 2 years later, 1905, it sparks this massive militant Swadeshi mass movement. But then, by 1907, the very leaders of that movement are fracturing at Surat. And by 1909, the British successfully lock in the Marley-Minto reforms, institutionalizing religious division. So in less than a decade, India goes from a place of polite, formal petitioning into an absolute theater of militant mass struggle, followed directly by calculated, devastating imperial repression. Jawaharlal Nehru actually summed up the devastating legacy of those 1909 reforms perfectly with this quote. He pointed out that these separate electorates created a political barrier that grew like a canker, completely corrupting the entire system from the inside out. What the 1909 reforms actually gave the people was just a shadow, definitely not substance. It was benevolent despotism that effectively divided the masses and left behind a highly toxic legacy for the future of the entire subcontinent. Which brings us to the end of this explainer, but I want to leave you with one final, profound question to think about. If the moderates and the extremists had somehow managed to swallow their pride, put aside their differences, and stay united at Surat back in 1907, could that British strategy of divide and rule have ever truly succeeded? It really forces us to ask, how much of history is shaped by the sheer strength of the enemy, and how much is ultimately decided by our very own internal fractures? Think about that. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.